Snow drifted against the tall windows of Ashcombe Manor like pale ash scattered, softening the outlines of the ancient estate while hundreds of candles burned within its marble halls. Beyond the iron gates, carriages rolled through the frozen night, delivering dukes, countesses, and silk-draped daughters into the warmth of the Ashcombe winter ball. Music rose beneath glittering chandeliers while servants moved through crowds carrying silver trays with champagne and sugared fruits. Every polished mirror reflected wealth, laughter, and practiced elegance. Yet beneath the golden brilliance lingered the sharp scent of judgment, hidden beneath perfume and velvet smiles. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood near the ballroom staircase with one gloved hand resting lightly against her abdomen, though the gesture was so fleeting no guest would have noticed it. Her ivory gown shimmered whenever candlelight touched the embroidery threaded along its sleeves, and pearls glimmered softly against her throat. At only 22, Eleanor possessed the sort of beauty painters ruin themselves attempting to immortalize: luminous gray eyes, dark chestnut curls arranged beneath delicate combs, and a gentleness that made society mistake kindness for weakness. Tonight, exhaustion shadowed her expression. The music seemed distant to her, blurred beneath the violent rhythm of her thoughts. Across the ballroom stood her husband. Lord Cedric Ashcombe leaned beside a marble pillar beneath the balcony gallery, tall and severe in black evening attire that sharpened every cold angle of his face. He was admired with equal measures of fascination and fear. Women whispered about his striking appearance. Men envied the authority in his voice. Yet no rumor captured the loneliness concealed behind his composure. Even among hundreds of guests, Cedric appeared utterly alone. He acknowledged compliments with restrained nods and accepted greetings without warmth. When his gaze finally met Eleanor's across the ballroom, she felt the familiar ache that had followed her through 2 years of marriage. There had once been tenderness between them. In the early months after their wedding, Cedric had walked beside her through the rose gardens at dusk and listened while she read poetry beside the library fire. But grief and endless obligations had slowly hollowed the spaces between them until conversation itself became fragile. Some evenings they dined together without exchanging more than a handful of words. Still, Eleanor had carried hope within her heart like a hidden flame. Tonight she intended to tell him. The orchestra shifted into a waltz as noble couples swept gracefully across the polished floor. Eleanor descended the staircase, her pulse trembling beneath her skin. Several ladies paused mid-conversation to admire her gown, though their smiles sharpened when she passed beyond hearing. "Poor creature," one whispered behind a jeweled fan. "Lord Ashcombe scarcely looks at her now." Eleanor continued walking without reacting, yet humiliation warmed her cheeks. Society possessed a terrible appetite for unhappy marriages. The powerful were permitted cruelty provided it remained elegant. Cedric noticed her approaching and straightened slightly. "You appear pale," he said once she reached him. His tone remained calm, though distant. "Perhaps you ought to rest. I wish to speak with you privately." A faint line appeared between his brows. Without protest, he guided her through the ballroom doors and into the western corridor overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Music echoed behind them while silence gathered between each footstep. Tall mirrors reflected them side by side. The beautiful young wife and the cold aristocrat whose affection had become a subject of gossip throughout London. Eleanor folded trembling fingers together. "Cedric," she began softly, "there is something I must tell you before others begin to notice." He waited. For one suspended moment, fear nearly stole her courage. Yet she had imagined this scene countless times. Perhaps he would soften. Perhaps the distance between them would finally break apart beneath joy. A fragile smile touched her lips. "We are to have a child." The words disappeared into stillness. Beyond the windows, snowflakes drifted through moonlight. Somewhere inside the ballroom, guests applauded the end of a dance. Cedric did not move. Eleanor searched his face for surprise, relief, anything resembling happiness. Instead, a terrible emptiness settled across his features. "No," he said quietly. Her smile faltered. "Cedric, I do not want it." 5 words. Nothing more. Yet they struck with such force that Eleanor physically stepped backward. She stared at him, unable to breathe. Behind them, the ballroom doors had opened slightly as passing guests entered the corridor. Conversation softened. A countess glanced toward Eleanor. Another guest pretended not to listen while listening to everything. Cedric noticed none of it. His jaw tightened as though he regretted speaking at all, but no apology followed. Eleanor's fingers slipped against the railing beside her. "You cannot mean that." "I mean precisely what I said." A champagne glass shattered somewhere nearby. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Heat rushed into Eleanor's face, not from anger, but from humiliation so deep it hollowed her from within. She had imagined tears, perhaps even disagreement, but never this cold rejection. Not of her alone, but of the innocent life already growing beneath her heart. "Guess we're watching now." A woman murmured, "Did you hear him?" Another replied, "How dreadful." Cedric exhaled sharply and looked away as though the conversation exhausted him. That gesture wounded Eleanor more deeply than the words themselves. She realized then that her happiness had been hers alone all along. Without another sentence, Cedric turned and walked back toward the ballroom, disappearing into candlelight and music while whispers spread behind him like spilled wine across white linen. Eleanor remained motionless beside the window long after he vanished. Snow gathered over the gardens below. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass. A young wife dressed in pearls and silk, learning how cruel loneliness could become inside a crowded room. Then, as she steadied herself against the marble railing, she overheard two servants speaking beyond the corridor archway. "They say his lordship may seek an annulment," one whispered. "And with a child involved?" A pause followed. "Perhaps because of it." Morning settled over Ashcombe Manor beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, and with it came the quiet cruelty of gossip. Newspapers arriving from London carried harmless reports of operas and parliamentary dinners, yet the true headlines moved through drawing rooms by whispered voices alone. By breakfast, Eleanor understood that nearly every noble household in the county had heard some version of what occurred at the winter ball. Some claimed Lord Cedric despised his marriage. Others insisted the unborn child threatened the Ashcombe inheritance itself. Eleanor endured the days that followed like a woman wandering through cold water. Servants lowered their eyes whenever she entered a room. She took her meals alone beneath painted ceilings while winter rain struck softly against the manor windows. Cedric remained absent for long hours, consumed by estate affairs or avoiding her entirely. At night, she sometimes heard his footsteps outside her chamber before silence swallowed them again. Only Mrs. Agnes Holloway dared speak honestly. "You must not let their whispers poison your spirit, my lady," the older woman said gently one afternoon while arranging fresh coal beside Eleanor's fireplace. "Society adores cruelty because it distracts from its own unhappiness." Eleanor attempted a faint smile. "I fear society shall never tire of mine." Mrs. Holloway hesitated before replying. "His lordship watches you more closely than you believe." The remark lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after the housekeeper departed. She wished to dismiss it as kindness, yet small moments began troubling her certainty. Once, while crossing the gallery above the great hall, she noticed Cedric standing below beside the library doors. He appeared deep in conversation with a steward until his gaze lifted toward her. For a brief instant, concern flickered across his face before vanishing behind composure. Another evening, a servant delivered warm tea to Eleanor's chamber moments after she quietly confessed feeling ill. No request had been sent downstairs. Still, Cedric himself remained distant. Then the roses arrived. Eleanor discovered them one snowy morning upon the small writing desk near her bed. White winter roses tied with dark green ribbon, fresh despite the season. No card accompanied them. Their fragrance filled the room with delicate sweetness, stirring something fragile within her chest. She traced the petals carefully, wondering whether Cedric had sent them but lacked courage to attach his name. The next evening brought a silver music box left outside her chamber door. Inside, a soft melody played when opened, haunting and slow, echoing through the candlelit room while snow drifted beyond the windows. Eleanor recognized the tune immediately. It was the same waltz performed during their first dance as husband and wife. Her breath caught painfully. Yet whenever they crossed paths at dinner or within the halls, he remained restrained and unreadable. The contradiction tormented her more deeply than indifference might have done. One afternoon, Eleanor entered the manor library and discovered a folded scrap of poetry resting atop an open book beside the fire. The handwriting was masculine and deliberate. Even the coldest winter fears the arrival of spring. Her fingers trembled around the note. Cedric had once copied poetry for her during the earliest months of their courtship. She remembered ink stains upon his hands and the rare softness in his voice whenever he read aloud beside the hearth. Before she could gather courage to seek him, footsteps sounded behind her. Lady Beatrice Whitmore entered the library dressed in sapphire velvet, her golden hair arranged beneath a feathered hat that framed her beauty with calculated perfection. She moved through the room with the confidence of a woman long accustomed to admiration. "Lady Ashcombe," she said smoothly, "I had not realized you were receiving callers." Eleanor folded the note instinctively. "Nor had I." A faint smile touched Beatrice's lips as her gaze drifted toward the roses near the fireplace. London has become terribly interested in your marriage lately. One hardly attends supper without hearing your name. I imagine that pleases society immensely. Society prefers tragedy to happiness, Beatrice replied. It finds heartbreak more entertaining. Though her tone remained pleasant, Eleanor sensed danger beneath every polished word. Beatrice had once been expected to marry Cedric before the engagement mysteriously dissolved years earlier. Rumors surrounding their history still lingered through aristocratic circles like perfume refusing to fade. Days later, Cedric escorted both women to a royal charity opera in London, where crystal chandeliers illuminated tiers of nobles glittering in diamonds and silk. Eleanor felt every stare upon her as she entered Cedric's private box. Conversations quieted. Fans fluttered. During intermission, Lady Beatrice laughed softly while several guests lingered nearby. One cannot help admiring Lord Ashcombe's patience, she remarked carelessly. Marriage built upon obligation must require extraordinary endurance. Silence followed. Eleanor's face drained of color. The insult, though elegantly phrased, landed with brutal precision. Nearby aristocrats pretended fascination with the orchestra below while straining to overhear every word. Cedric turned slowly toward Beatrice. For one dangerous moment, Eleanor expected another cold silence. Instead, he removed the heavy Ashcombe cloak from his shoulders and draped it carefully around Eleanor himself. The dark fabric carried the scent of cedar and winter air. His gloved hand brushed lightly against her trembling fingers. If society must speak, Cedric said evenly, his voice carrying through the private box, it shall do so while remembering she bears my name. The tension shattered across the theater like cracked glass. Beatrice's smile stiffened. Murmurs spread immediately among nearby guests. Eleanor could scarcely breathe. The opera ended beneath a storm of whispers. Rain lashed against the carriage windows during their journey home. Cedric sat opposite Eleanor in silence, shadows shifting across his face whenever lightning flashed beyond the glass. Then a sharp pain twisted through Eleanor's abdomen. She gasped quietly and pressed a gloved hand downward. When she lifted it moments later, dark crimson stained the pale silk. Cedric saw it instantly. For the first time since the ballroom humiliation, genuine fear shattered the icy distance, hardening Cedric Ashcombe's unforgiving expression completely tonight. Rain battered the windows of Ashcombe Manor for 3 consecutive days after Eleanor's collapse, wrapping the estate in a gloom so heavy even the servants lowered their voices while passing through its corridors. Dr. Julian Mercer forbade her from leaving bed, insisting that strain or distress could endanger both mother and child. Fires burned constantly within her chamber, yet Eleanor often shivered beneath layers of blankets, haunted less by physical weakness than by the memory of Cedric's expression inside the carriage when he saw the blood upon her glove. Fear had transformed him. Not anger. Not irritation. Fear. The realization unsettled her more deeply than cruelty ever had. Each morning Mrs. Holloway arrived carrying broth or tea, gently adjusting curtains to allow pale winter light into the room. She spoke little of London gossip, though Eleanor sensed scandal continuing beyond the manor walls. Instead, the older woman described practical matters: fresh snow covering the gardens, servants repairing frozen pipes, Dr. Mercer's instructions regarding rest. Yet one detail returned repeatedly. His lordship asked whether you slept peacefully. Lord Ashcombe requested additional wood for your fire. Always indirect. Always distant. Cedric himself never entered while Eleanor remained awake. Still, evidence of him lingered everywhere. One evening she discovered fresh roses replaced beside the fireplace. Another night a heavy shawl appeared folded neatly at the foot of her bed after the temperature dropped unexpectedly. Eleanor recognized it immediately as Cedric's favorite traveling wrap, lined with dark wool and carrying the faint scent of cedar smoke. The contradictions exhausted her heart. Outside her chamber, the manor remained silent as a mausoleum. Inside, Eleanor's thoughts wandered endlessly through memories she once tried to preserve like pressed flowers between book pages. She remembered Cedric during their engagement, when restraint occasionally gave way to rare tenderness. Once, during a summer storm, he had removed his gloves simply to warm her hands between his own. Another time he traveled through the night to retrieve a necklace she casually admired weeks earlier in London. He had never spoken love aloud, yet fragments of devotion had existed once. What destroyed them afterward? The question lingered like smoke. Late one evening, thunder rolled across the countryside while Eleanor sat beside the fire unable to sleep. Wind rattled the tall windows. Shadows shifted across the chamber walls whenever lightning illuminated the sky beyond the curtains. Mrs. Holloway entered quietly carrying warmed milk, though her expression appeared troubled. "My lady," she began carefully, "there are truths grief teaches men to bury so deeply they scarcely understand them themselves." Eleanor looked toward her. "You speak of Cedric." The older woman hesitated before nodding. "When his lordship was born, the late countess died before sunrise. Lord Ashcombe's father never forgave the child for surviving her." Mrs. Holloway's voice softened further. "The old earl called him cursed from the age of 5 onward. Every mistake, every sorrow within this house became the boy's burden." Eleanor stared into the fire while thunder murmured through the manor. "He fears becoming his father," she whispered. Mrs. Holloway's silence confirmed it. After the housekeeper departed, Eleanor remained awake long after midnight, listening to rain strike the glass. At last she rose carefully from bed, wrapping Cedric's shawl around her shoulders before wandering toward the library downstairs. The corridors lay deserted beneath dim gas lamps. Somewhere distant, grandfather clocks echoed through the sleeping estate. The library fire still burned faintly. Eleanor crossed toward the shelves seeking distraction, but her attention caught upon a leather portfolio resting partly open atop Cedric's writing desk. She recognized his handwriting immediately across a folded page tucked carelessly inside. She should not have read it. Yet loneliness and grief weakened propriety. With trembling fingers, Eleanor unfolded the letter. The date revealed it had been written only days after the winter ball. "I heard your voice speak of the child and all I felt was terror." The sentence blurred briefly before her eyes. "I wished to rejoice as another man might have done. Instead, I remembered my father standing above me beside my mother's portrait, saying I had entered this world through blood and taken everything gentle with me. I have spent my life fearing that affection given by me becomes suffering eventually." Eleanor pressed a hand against her mouth. Lightning flashed across the windows while she continued reading. "You deserve a husband capable of warmth without struggle. I know only restraint. Yet God help me, Eleanor, every hour spent away from you becomes its own punishment. When I saw blood upon your glove tonight, I understood that losing you would destroy what little remains untouched inside me." The letter ended there and signed and unsent. Emotion tightened painfully within Eleanor's chest. For the first time since their marriage began unraveling, she glimpsed the wounded soul concealed beneath Cedric's cruelty. His rejection had not come from indifference alone, but from terror inherited through years of emotional brutality. A floorboard creaked behind her. Eleanor turned sharply. Cedric stood near the doorway, rain clinging to his dark coat as though he had just returned from outside. His gaze moved instantly toward the letter trembling within her hands. For one suspended moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, with unmistakable anguish beneath the words, "You were never meant to read that." Eleanor's heartbeat stumbled while thunder shook the windows. She expected anger, perhaps humiliation, yet Cedric only looked exhausted, like a man stripped bare before judgment. Slowly she placed the letter upon the desk between them. "You believed our child would inherit your suffering," she whispered. His jaw tightened. "I believed he would inherit me." The confession fractured the distance between them more surely than any embrace could have done. Cedric stepped forward when Eleanor swayed from weakness, his hands catching her waist before she could fall. Warmth rushed through her despite the storm. For several trembling seconds neither released the other. Then distant carriage wheels echoed suddenly outside, followed by knocking below stairs and a servant crying Lady Beatrice's name. The sound of Lady Beatrice Whitmore's arrival spread through Ashcombe Manor with the force of a storm entering an already fractured house. Servants hurried through corridors carrying dripping coats and lanterns while thunder rolled beyond the windows. Eleanor instinctively stepped away from Cedric, though the warmth of his hands lingered against her waist long after the distance returned between them. Cedric's expression hardened immediately. "She should not be here," he said coldly. Before Eleanor could reply, the library doors opened and Beatrice entered beneath the flickering firelight, elegant despite the rain darkening the hem of her sapphire gown. Her gaze swept across the room with sharp intelligence, lingering briefly upon the letter still resting atop Cedric's desk. "How fortunate," she said smoothly, removing her gloves. "I feared I might interrupt something important." "You already have," Cedric answered. The chill in his voice might have unsettled another woman, yet Beatrice merely smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it is best I speak plainly." Eleanor straightened despite her weakness. Every instinct warned her this visit carried purpose beyond courtesy. Beatrice withdrew several folded papers from her reticule and placed them carefully upon the desk beside the unsent letter Eleanor had just discovered. I came to prevent a greater embarrassment later. Cedric's jaw tightened. What games are these? No game at all. Beatrice's tone remained calm, almost sympathetic. Only protection. Society can forgive many scandals, Cedric, but not deception. Eleanor felt unease coil within her chest. Beatrice turned toward her with practiced gentleness. Before your marriage, Lord Ashcombe wrote me dozens of letters professing devotion. Some were composed mere weeks before your engagement announcement. Her eyes shifted deliberately toward Cedric. London would find such timing interesting. Cedric said nothing. The silence itself became dangerous. Beatrice continued softly, should these letters become public, society will conclude your marriage was born not from affection but necessity. And unfortunately, when people question a marriage, they soon question the child within it. The implication struck Eleanor like ice water. Cedric stepped forward at last. You will not speak another word against my wife. Your wife. Beatrice echoed quietly. The same wife you humiliated before half of London? Pain flickered across Cedric's face before vanishing. Eleanor suddenly understood the true cruelty of Beatrice's attack. The woman did not merely seek revenge. She intended to deepen every wound already dividing husband and wife until nothing remained between them except shame. Outside, lightning illuminated the windows in violent flashes. Beatrice gathered the papers once more. The Royal Spring Banquet is 3 evenings from now. Influential families from across London shall attend. Her gaze sharpened slightly. I wonder what they would think if these letters appeared there. Leave, Cedric said. For the first time, genuine emotion surfaced beneath Beatrice's polished composure. You once promised me forever, she whispered. Now you defend a woman who scarcely knows you. Cedric's reply came without hesitation. She knows enough. Something fragile shifted inside Eleanor at those words. They were not tender, nor spoken with romantic flourish, yet they carried a quiet certainty absent from him for months. Beatrice recognized it too. A wounded expression crossed her face before pride concealed it again. Without another sentence, she swept from the library, leaving thunder and silence behind her. Eleanor stared toward the closed doors long after Beatrice vanished. The letters, she said quietly. Did you love her? Cedric remained motionless beside the fire. At one time I believed I might. His honesty hurt precisely because it lacked cruelty. My father arranged the match. Affection was expected to follow. And with me? He looked toward her then, and the exhaustion within his eyes seemed older than either of them. With you, he said slowly, nothing occurred as expected. The confession lingered between them like candlelight trembling against darkness. 3 nights later, London glittered beneath thousands of gas lamps as carriages crowded outside the royal banquet hall. Rain shimmered across the cobblestones while noble guests ascended marble steps wrapped in velvet and diamonds. Inside, chandeliers blazed above towering floral arrangements and musicians performed beneath gilded balconies. Eleanor entered beside Cedric wearing silver silk that flowed softly around her growing figure. Whispers followed them immediately. There they are. She looks pale. Do you suppose the rumors are true? Cedric offered no acknowledgement to the murmurs surrounding them. His gloved hand remained firm against Eleanor's arm as he guided her through the ballroom. Though his expression stayed composed, Eleanor sensed tension radiating beneath his restraint. At the center of the hall stood Lady Beatrice. She wore crimson velvet tonight, beautiful as spilled wine beneath candlelight. Conversation gradually quieted as she approached them carrying a crystal glass between elegant fingers. How lovely to see reconciliation, she remarked pleasantly. London feared Lord Ashcombe incapable of tenderness. Several nearby aristocrats exchanged careful glances. Cedric's voice remained level. State your purpose plainly. Beatrice smiled. Very well. She withdrew folded letters from her reticule before the surrounding guests. I merely wondered whether Lady Ashcombe deserves knowledge of the vows once written to another woman by her husband. A hush spread outward through the ballroom. Eleanor felt dozens of eyes settle upon her. Beatrice unfolded one letter deliberately. You wrote that no future could exist in which you belonged to anyone else. Cedric's face darkened. And yet, Beatrice continued softly, weeks later you married a frightened young woman carrying the burden of restoring her family's fortune. Her gaze shifted toward Eleanor. Tell me, my dear, did he ever confess he never wished for this marriage at all? The ballroom fell utterly silent. Eleanor's pulse thundered painfully beneath her skin. Shame threatened to close around her once more, just as it had during the winter ball. For one terrible moment she feared Cedric would retreat again into silence, allowing humiliation to consume her before all of London. Instead he stepped forward. Without warning, Cedric took the letters from Beatrice's hands and cast them directly into the towering banquet fireplace. Gasps erupted across the hall as flames consumed the pages. Beatrice stared in stunned disbelief. Cedric turned then not toward society but toward Eleanor alone. "The gravest mistake of my life," he said, his voice carrying clearly beneath the chandeliers, "was allowing this woman to believe herself unloved." The words struck the ballroom into silence deeper than shock itself. Eleanor's breath caught painfully as Cedric removed his gloves and offered her his bare hand before all of London society. Not as obligation. Not as performance. As choice. Trembling, Eleanor placed her hand within his. At that exact moment, a violent pain tore suddenly through her body. Her knees weakened beneath her, and fear flashed across Cedric's face as Eleanor clutched his arm, whispering his name while thunder shattered the skies above London once more. Panic swept through the ballroom the instant Eleanor collapsed against Cedric's chest. Musicians faltered into silence while startled aristocrats stepped backward from the unfolding scene, their jeweled faces pale beneath the chandelier light. Rain hammered against the tall windows of the banquet hall as thunder rolled above London like distant cannon fire. Cedric caught Eleanor before she could fall completely. Her fingers clutched weakly at the front of his coat while pain twisted across her face. For one terrible moment, the noise of the ballroom vanished entirely from Cedric's awareness. He saw only Eleanor trembling in his arms, fragile and exhausted beneath the harsh brilliance of society's gaze. "Fetch the carriage," he ordered sharply. No one moved quickly enough. "I said now." The force in his voice shattered the paralysis surrounding them. Servants rushed toward the entrance while guests whispered anxiously behind raised gloves and fans. Lady Beatrice stood motionless near the fireplace, watching the chaos with widening eyes. Whatever satisfaction she once sought had vanished beneath the reality before her. Cedric lifted Eleanor into his arms without hesitation. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. A man of Cedric Ashcombe's rigid dignity was not expected to carry his wife openly through a crowded hall like a desperate lover from a tragic opera. Yet he paid no attention to scandal now. As he crossed the marble floor beneath glittering chandeliers, Eleanor rested weakly against him, her silver gown spilling over his dark sleeves like moonlight against shadow. "Cedric," she whispered faintly, struggling for breath. "I have you," he answered immediately. "Do not fear." The words came instinctively, stripped of all restraint. Rain lashed violently across the city during their journey back to Ashcombe Manor. The carriage wheels struck flooded streets while lightning illuminated Cedric's face in brief flashes of silver-white light. Eleanor's pain worsened with every passing mile. Dr. Mercer, summoned from the banquet itself, sat opposite them with grim concentration. "She must remain conscious," he warned quietly. Cedric kept Eleanor's trembling hands enclosed tightly within his own. "You shall scold me tomorrow for forcing you through this storm," he murmured, his voice low beside her ear. "You shall tell me I drive carriage horses too hard and frighten servants unnecessarily. Do you understand me?" A faint, fragile smile touched Eleanor's lips despite the pain. "You sound afraid," she whispered. The honesty of the observation struck him silent. Because he was afraid. Terrified beyond language itself. Ashcombe Manor emerged through the rain at last, towering against the storm-dark countryside like some ancient cathedral wrapped in shadow. Servants hurried through the entrance carrying lanterns while Mrs. Holloway directed preparations upstairs with trembling urgency. Eleanor was brought immediately to her chamber as thunder shook the windows overhead. Then the doors closed. Cedric found himself standing alone outside the room while doctors and servants moved within beyond his reach. The corridor seemed unbearably narrow suddenly, suffocating despite its grandeur. Candlelight flickered across oil portraits lining the walls, generations of Ashcombe ancestors staring down with cold aristocratic dignity. For years Cedric had believed himself incapable of vulnerability. Now helplessness consumed him entirely. Dr. Mercer emerged briefly near midnight, exhaustion visible beneath his composed expression. "The labor has come too early," he admitted carefully. "Lady Ashcombe is weak, but she continues fighting." Cedric's throat tightened painfully. "And the child?" The doctor hesitated. "We must pray." The answer hollowed the air from Cedric's lungs. After Mercer returned inside, Cedric wandered toward the library like a man fleeing execution. Rain battered the tall windows while firelight trembled across the room where Eleanor had discovered his hidden confession days earlier. He stared at the dying flames without seeing them. Every cruel word he had ever spoken returned now with merciless clarity. I do not want it. The memory struck him harder than thunder. He covered his face briefly with trembling hands, overcome by a grief so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. For years he had feared becoming his father, feared poisoning every gentle thing placed within his care. Yet in trying to escape inherited cruelty, he had repeated it instead. A quiet sound behind him interrupted the silence. Mrs. Holloway stood near the doorway holding a fresh candle. Age and sorrow softened her features as she looked toward him. She asks for you, the older woman said gently. Cedric froze. Then he crossed the corridor faster than dignity allowed. Eleanor's chamber glowed dimly beneath candlelight and storm shadow. Curtains billowed softly around the windows while Dr. Mercer stood near the fireplace preparing fresh linens. Eleanor lay pale against white pillows, strands of dark hair clinging to her damp skin. Exhaustion had hollowed her delicate features, yet her gray eyes searched immediately for Cedric the moment he entered. He moved beside her bed without speaking. Eleanor reached weakly toward him. Cedric took her hand carefully, lowering himself into the chair beside her as though afraid she might disappear if released even briefly. Her fingers trembled within his. I am sorry, he whispered suddenly. The words fractured inside the room. Eleanor studied him quietly through the stormlit darkness. I was cruel when you offered me joy, Cedric continued, his voice breaking for the first time in his adult life. I allowed fear to speak where love should have answered. Every hour since has punished me more thoroughly than society ever could. Tears gathered silently in Eleanor's eyes. Cedric pressed her hand against his forehead, surrendering every remaining piece of pride. If heaven demands payment for my failures, let it take every title, every possession, every breath from me. Only do not leave this world believing yourself unloved. The confession seemed to still the storm itself. Eleanor's fingers brushed lightly through his dark hair with astonishing tenderness. You are not your father, she whispered. Emotion closed painfully around Cedric's throat. Before he could answer, a violent wave of pain overtook Eleanor once more. Dr. Mercer moved immediately beside the bed while servants hurried forward carrying heated water and linens. Cedric tried to remain steady for her sake, yet terror consumed him as the hours dragged endlessly onward beneath thunder and candlelight. Then, sometime before dawn, silence suddenly filled the chamber. A single suspended heartbeat. Another. And then, the cry of an infant pierced the storm. Cedric closed his eyes sharply as the sound shattered something hardened inside him forever. Dr. Mercer exhaled with visible relief while Mrs. Holloway covered her mouth, overcome with tears. Beyond the windows, rain finally began to soften against the glass. A son, the doctor announced quietly. Cedric could not move. For several stunned seconds he simply stared toward the small child wrapped carefully in white linen near Eleanor's bedside. The infant's tiny cries echoed softly through the room, fragile and miraculous all at once. Eleanor looked toward Cedric with exhausted tenderness. Come here, she whispered. He approached slowly, almost fearfully. Mrs. Holloway placed the child carefully into his arms. Cedric stared downward in complete silence. The infant's impossibly small fingers curled instinctively around one of his own. Such a tiny gesture. Such a simple thing. Yet it undid him entirely. A broken sound escaped Cedric's throat as tears finally fell without restraint. He lowered his head beside the child, overcome by a love so fierce it frightened him more deeply than fear itself ever had. Eleanor watched him through exhausted eyes filled with quiet understanding. The same man who once rejected the child before it had drawn breath now held his son as though releasing him might shatter the world apart again. Outside the manor windows, dawn slowly emerged across the rain-soaked gardens. Pale golden light touched the estate for the first time in months, softening stone walls that had long seemed cold and unforgiving. And within the quiet warmth of Eleanor's chamber, Lord Cedric Ashcombe finally understood that love was not inherited through blood or ruined by fear. It was chosen, painfully and imperfectly, in the moments one remained when running away would have been easier.